What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. The authentic Captain Morgan was a lot cooler than the common booze named after him. When you hear the name Captain Morgan, images of bros posing with a handle of spiced rum with one foot dongang precariously in the air probably come to mind. The real Captain Morgan is not one of the many pirates whose reputations were built on boozing it up with bartenders, as modern rum-drinking frat brothers do. Although the name Sir Henry Morgan doesn't sound like one of the Caribbean's most terrifying pirates, the ruthless Captain Henry Morgan rose to fame and wealth by terrorizing his enemies and stealing a fortune in gold from the Spanish. These Henry Morgan facts are just one of many surprises in the history of piracy. Morgan was a Welsh farmer's son, but he wasn't meant to work on the farm. Instead, Captain Morgan crossed the Atlantic and became the most famous privateer of the 1600s. He became the leader of a powerful group of pirates called the Brethren of the Coast. He led a pirate army against the Spanish and eventually conquered the Western Hemisphere's second-largest city. And Captain Morgan didn't spend all of his gold on booze and prostitutes. Instead, he used it to buy a lot of land in Jamaica. Captain Morgan quit piracy when he got rich and became the governor of Jamaica. Captain Morgan became a pirate hero and one of England's most famous men after years of terrorizing the Spanish. And he carried out all of it by pillaging and looting. Did Captain Morgan exist? Definitely. And his buccaneering earns him a spot on the list of history's greatest pirates and an unlicensed Mascot deal for one of college freshmen's choice liquors. Captain Morgan used Nuns to capture a Spanish port. Morgan wasn't exactly a pirate, he was a privateer, licensed by the British government to attack the Spanish any time the two countries were at war, which was pretty much all the time in the 1600s. Therefore, technically speaking, Captain Morgan's raid on the Spanish town of Portobello in 1668 was legal in every way. In spite of the numerous guards, Captain Morgan was able to use a clever tactic to take the town. He used the Spaniards' Catholic faith against them. The captain anchored his ships far away to conceal his attack and struck at night by canoe. 2 of the 3 forts quickly fell. To take the third, Morgan used captured nuns as human shields, taking the city and a handsome pile of gold for his trouble. Captain Morgan ransomed an entire town for a fortune. The first step was only to capture Portobello. Because all of Peru's gold and silver went through Portobello on their way to Spain, Captain Morgan was aware that the Spanish would have to pay a lot to get the port back. Captain Morgan sent a ransom note for the entire city to the governor of Panama. He demanded 100,000 pieces of 8, the Spanish coin-based currency of the time, for the return of the port and its inhabitants, or else he'd burn the entire town to the ground. And to show he was confident, Morgan also sent the governor a pistol, declaring that it was so easy to take Portobello that he was already planning to return in a year to get his pistol back. The frightened governor paid the entire ransom. And Captain Morgan's success in Portobello helped him recruit even more followers. Captain Morgan was generous to his men, but he popped out prisoners' eyeballs. Morgan always promised to reward his men for their service. And he was often more generous than the Royal Navy. In 1670, Morgan drafted self-governing articles with his followers, essentially a contract, as he planned the assault on Panama. The captains of each ship would receive a hefty share of the treasure, while every man was covered by disability compensation in case they were harmed during the raid. The pirates could even get a bonus of 50 pieces of 8 for bravery. Morgan only claimed 1% of the profits for himself, sharing generously with his men. But that generosity ended when it came to prisoners. Captain Morgan wasn't shy about using violence. If he needed information out of a prisoner, Captain Morgan would strap a leather cord around the person's head and tighten it with a metal bar until his eyeballs popped out. Captain Morgan blew up his own ship to take a port. Captain Morgan's enemies always underestimated him. In 1669, he sailed 7 ships to the Venezuelan port of Maracaibo. Although they outnumbered the Spaniards, the Spanish flagship had more firepower than Morgan's entire fleet. But Captain Morgan still sent a demand for surrender to the Don Alonso del Campo y Espinosa, who led the Spaniards. Espinosa would soon feel bad about his decision to decline. Morgan ordered his pirates to turn one of their 7 ships into a fire ship. It was packed with explosives and aimed toward the Spaniards. Espinosa heard about the plan but dismissed it, claiming that the pirates lacked the shrewdness to use the sophisticated strategy. But Morgan was willing to sacrifice one of his ships to take the port. He packed explosives and disguised wooden guns with 12 men aboard the fire ship. At the last minute, they lit their own ship on fire and grappled directly to the Spanish flagship. Fire quickly spread in the Spanish ships, and the pirates easily took Maracaibo, earning 250,000 pieces of 8 in ransom money. Captain Morgan had no trouble recruiting followers. Captain Morgan was one of the most successful privateers in history. Additionally, men were lining up to join his brethren of the coast due to the high profits generated by his devilish raids. The captain already had 500 followers when the raid on Portobello in 1668 took place. The next year, that number had risen to 650 men. And after taking 250,000 pieces of 8, Morgan had even more men eager to sail with him. Morgan called for new recruits after Maracaibo. A stunning 2,000 men and 37 ships showed up at Tortuga on October 24, 1670, eager to hear Captain Morgan's next target. Captain Morgan set his sights on Panama, the second largest city in the New World. Captain Morgan chose Panama, the second largest city in the New World, as his new target following successful raids in Portobello and Maracaibo. But it wouldn't be an easy target. Panama was the biggest city Captain Morgan had ever attempted to take, and he was leading a much larger force of men than in his previous successful raids. Morgan had to lead his troops through the jungle before they could take the fortified city because Panama was on the Pacific side of the isthmus. On the perilous journey, the captain prepared his assault on the Spanish stronghold with approximately 1,000 men. Captain Morgan entered Panama's gates in January 1671. He prepared for the President of Panama, who commanded 1,200 men and 400 cavalry, to launch an assault on the city. The pirates won the Battle of Panama and even got a barbecue for their troubles. On January 28, 1671, Captain Morgan led the assault on Panama. His enemies had more men, 400 mounted fighters, and some oxen they planned to stampede toward the pirates. But the Spanish cavalry was no match for Captain Morgan's sharpshooters. And when the Spanish infantry charged, Morgan quickly repelled them and turned the battle into a rout. Not even the oxen fazed the pirates. Most of the cattle simply ran away from the noisy battle, while the few that made it to the enemy side were easily killed. Morgan's men were starving after crossing through the jungles of Panama, and they slaughtered the oxen for a victory barbecue. At the end of the day, 500 Spaniards were dead, and Morgan only lost 15 of his men. With just one arrow, one of Morgan's followers took over a fort. In order to take Panama, Captain Morgan first had to capture a fort at the Chagres River. The Spanish knew the pirates were coming, so it wasn't easy. Before Morgan could strike, they were able to double the garrison and increase the number of guns. The frontal assault against the walls was going badly until one of Morgan's men changed the entire battle with a single arrow. According to author Alexander Esquemeling, the man was hit by an arrow. He pulled the arrow from his body, wrapped it in a burning rag, and fired it at the Spanish with his musket because he was so enraged. The burning arrow struck the Spanish store of gunpowder, blowing it up and causing great ruin, and no less consternation to the Spaniards. Morgan's men were able to capture the fort as a result of that one stroke of good fortune. Captain Morgan's pirates controlled the Caribbean. The Brethren of the Coast were a group of pirates led by Captain Morgan, and they completely ruled the Caribbean. During the 30 Years' War around 1618, the Brethren emerged. The Spanish used their rich territories in the Caribbean to fund the war effort, so their European rivals, the Dutch and English, encouraged private captains to attack Spanish ships. By the time that Captain Morgan led the Brethren, they had bases all across the Caribbean, in Tortuga, Port Royal, and Nassau. The Brethren raided Spanish ships, halting the flow of gold and silver to Spain, and making themselves rich in the process. And during their decades of dominating the Caribbean, they helped develop the Pirate Code, which would define pirate life for centuries. The King of England knighted Captain Morgan, even though he was a war criminal. Because he was a privateer, Captain Morgan was authorized by the English to conduct wartime raids on the Spanish. When the two nations were at peace, Morgan was supposed to stand down. However, during his most infamous attack when Morgan took Panama, the Spanish had already signed a peace treaty with England. Officially, Captain Morgan was a war criminal and illegal pirate. When Captain Morgan returned to Jamaica after taking Panama, the governor arrested him and Morgan was sent to England to stand trial. But Morgan was treated like a celebrity, and even though the Spanish were furious, King Charles II knighted Captain Morgan in 1674. The captain eventually returned to Jamaica, where he served as acting governor for several years. Captain Morgan was the inspiration for Captain Blood. Captain Morgan's reputation was so powerful that he is considered one of the greatest pirates in history, even though he was technically a privateer rather than a pirate. In 1922, Raphael Sabatini even based his famous Captain Blood on Captain Morgan's life. However, Morgan was only a privateer for a portion of his life. After the successful raid on Panama, he retired from piracy, devoting the rest of his life to Jamaica. By then, Morgan had used much of his wealth to buy up land on the island, and he served as lieutenant governor and acting governor of the island until his death in 1688. He was so loved by the English that he was given a state funeral. Captain Morgan was able to use his brutal but clever tactics to turn himself into a respectable landowner, proving that he was also one of history's most brilliant pirates. The epic life of Captain Morgan reportedly influenced the Seagram Company. So how did Captain Morgan become associated with one of the most popular brands of spirits in the United States? The Seagram Company began using his name in 1944, and Captain Morgan Original Spiced Rum didn't reach the U.S. until 1984. It has since established itself as a standard brand, particularly among college students and spring breakers. Still, it's pretty bizarre that Henry Morgan became the inspiration for Captain Morgan's rum. The real Captain Morgan was incredibly strategic, and he used his years of piracy to propel himself into the richest classes of society. As Graham Thomas explains, Morgan was a planner, a brilliant military strategist and intensely loyal to the king, to England and to Jamaica. However, he also made a name for himself as a politician and an advocate for peaceful trade, opting instead to live his life as a wealthy and well-liked landowner. Most folks who consume Captain Morgan on a regular basis are unlikely to possess the brilliance and strategy of the man on the bottle. When you hear the name Captain Morgan, your brain probably conjures up the image of a goofy red-coated mascot slapped across a bottle of spiced rum, complete with a cocked leg and a cheeky grin. But long before frat parties and barroom shenanigans turned his name into a liquor brand punchline, the real Captain Morgan was an absolute legend. An unstoppable force of piratical brilliance, military genius, and Machiavellian cunning who terrified the Spanish Empire, amassed an obscene amount of gold, and went on to rule a nation he helped reshape with cannon fire and cutlasses. Yes, Captain Henry Morgan was very real, and no matter how iconic the booze named after him is, it doesn't even scratch the surface of how epically badass the real man was. He wasn't your average rum-guzzling rogue. He was a cunning, brutal, brilliant privateer who played nations against each other, outwitted generals, sacked the wealthiest cities in the New World, and casually used nuns as human shields like it was just another Tuesday. Born the son of a Welsh farmer in the 1630s, Morgan wasn't exactly born into swashbuckling legend status, but he had an unshakable talent for seizing opportunity. By the time he was in his 30s, Morgan had already made a name for himself leading the Brethren of the Coast, a terrifying alliance of pirates, privateers, and ne'er-do-wells who treated the Caribbean like their own bloody playground. While many pirates bumbled their way through booze and bar fights, Morgan was strategic, fearless, and ferociously effective. He wasn't just raiding ports. He was flipping the entire power structure of the New World. He didn't just show up with guns blazing when he attacked the heavily fortified Spanish city of Portobello in 1668. He also showed up with stealth, strategy, and guts. After landing under cover of darkness, Morgan's men took the first two forts with shocking ease. But the third, that was trickier. So Morgan got creative and brutal. He took captured nuns and priests and literally used them as human shields, forcing the Spanish into a moral stalemate that allowed him to seize the final fort and walk off with mountains of gold. But that wasn't enough. Morgan wasn't just raiding for fun. He was shaking empires. After sacking Portobello, he ransomed the city back to the Spanish for 100,000 pieces of eight, sending the terrified governor a cocky note with a pistol enclosed, daring him to come retrieve it next year. The Spanish paid up, and Morgan's legend, and his following, grew tenfold. Morgan shared the wealth, in contrast to other leaders who hoarded wealth. He drew up articles of agreement that guaranteed his men fair shares, injury compensation, and even bravery bonuses. He only got a 1% cut for himself, which still indicated that he was rich in the grand pirate economy. That kind of leadership drew men to him in droves. Morgan was in charge of over 2,000 men and 37 ships by 1670, making him one of the most terrifying pirate forces the Caribbean had ever seen. It was game on when he set his sights on Panama, the wealthiest and most fortified city in the New World. The war in Panama was nothing short of catastrophic. To reach the city, Morgan's army had to drag itself through swamps, jungles, disease, and starvation before they could face 1,200 Spanish soldiers and 400 cavalry. The Spanish thought that oxen would drive Morgan's men into a stampede. Instead, Morgan's sharpshooters picked off the cavalry, and the pirates literally barbecued the oxen after the battle for a celebratory feast. Over 500 Spaniards perished. Morgan lost 15 men. And yes, he still looted the place blind. However, Morgan's tale did not conclude with plunder. By chance, the man who set fire to cities and brutally tortured prisoners eventually became Jamaica's lieutenant governor. That's right. This pirate-turned-statesman ended up running the very colony he once used as his raiding base. He bought up land, got knighted, and even lived long enough to see himself become one of England's most celebrated heroes. He spent his final years drinking, throwing extravagant parties, and watching as his name spread across oceans and became diluted into a jovial face on a bottle of rum centuries later. But make no mistake, the real Captain Morgan wasn't a brand. He was a blood-soaked, gold-hungry, war-hardened mastermind whose legend was written in fire and fear, and who earned every ounce of his infamy the hard way, with cannonballs, charisma, and cold-blooded strategy. The real Captain Morgan was a ruthless pirate who was a lot cooler than the brand of rum. The majority of people associate the name Captain Morgan with a jovial, peg-legged pirate who appears on spiced rum bottles and is the mascot of beachside cocktails and college parties. However, Sir Henry Morgan, the real Captain Morgan, was much more than just a drunken caricature. A Welshman who rose from obscurity to become the terror of the Spanish Main, a conqueror of cities, and eventually the governor of Jamaica. He was one of the most feared and brilliant privateers of the 17th century. His life was a saga of naval battles, psychological warfare, and brutal cunning that was far more thrilling than any advertisement for a bourbon could ever hope to capture. From Welsh farmer to pirate king, Henry Morgan was the son of a farmer and was born in Wales in 1635. But farming was never his destiny. He crossed the Atlantic in his early 20s and joined the Brethren of the Coast, a loose group of pirates and privateers in the Caribbean. Unlike the lawless pirates of later legend, Morgan was a privateer, licensed by the British Crown to attack Spanish ships and settlements. England and Spain were in a near-constant state of war, and Morgan became England's most ruthless weapon in the Caribbean. The sack of Portobello, using nuns as human shields. The 1668 capture of Portobello, a heavily fortified Spanish port in modern-day Panama, was one of Morgan's most daring raids. The city was guarded by 3 forts and a garrison of trained soldiers, but Morgan wasn't deterred. Stealth approach. Morgan anchored his ships far away and approached by canoe in the dark, avoiding a direct naval assault. Psychological warfare. The 3rd fort held out after his men stormed the first 2. As a result, Morgan took nuns and priests captive and made them carry ladders and shields as his men moved forward. The Spanish waited because they didn't want to shoot at holy people, and Morgan took the city. The ransom. Morgan demanded 100,000 pieces of 8 Spanish silver coins to spare Portobello because the city was crucial to Spain's gold shipments. He even sent the governor of Panama a pistol as a taunt, boasting he'd return in a year to retrieve it. The terrified governor paid up. The fire ship Gambit, blowing up his own vessel to win. In 1669, Morgan targeted Maracaibo, Venezuela, but faced a problem. A massive Spanish warship, the Magdalena, guarded the harbor. Morgan turned one of his own ships into a floating bomb because he was outnumbered. The trap. He loaded a vessel with explosives, tar and gunpowder, then disguised it with fake wooden cannons. The sacrifice. A skeleton crew steered the ship directly into the Magdalena, grappling it before lighting the fuse and escaping. The explosion destroyed the Spanish flagship, and Morgan's fleet easily captured Maracaibo. The payday. He walked away with 250,000 pieces of 8, an unimaginable fortune. The raid on Panama, conquering the second-largest city in the Americas. In 1671, Morgan achieved his greatest success when he targeted Panama City, the wealthiest Spanish settlement in the New World. The Jungle March. Morgan led 1,200 men through disease-ridden jungles, surviving ambushes and starvation. The battle. Outnumbered by Spanish cavalry and infantry, Morgan's pirates used superior marksmanship to decimate their foes. The Spanish even tried stampeding oxen into Morgan's ranks, but his men killed and roasted them for a victory feast. The loot. Morgan still hauled away tons of gold, silver and jewels from Panama, which burned, possibly by accident. From pirate to governor. Morgan's shocking retirement. After years of plundering, Morgan retired in luxury. King Charles II, impressed by his service and likely his wealth, knighted him and made him lieutenant governor of Jamaica. The hypocrisy. Now a lawmaker, Morgan cracked down on piracy, even hanging former comrades. The legacy. He died in 1688, a rich and respected landowner, far from the drunken rogue of rum labels. Why the real Captain Morgan was nothing like the rum Mascot. He wasn't a drunk. Morgan was a strategic genius, not a bumbling party animal. He was a privateer, not a pirate. His raids were government-sanctioned. He was brutal but brilliant. From eyeball torture to human shields, Morgan did whatever it took to win. Conclusion. The man behind the myth. The real Captain Morgan wasn't just a swashbuckling adventurer. He was a ruthless tactician, a master of psychological warfare, and one of history's greatest privateers. His boldness, deceit, and sheer audacity are barely covered by the rum brand. So the next time you pour Captain Morgan, keep in mind that the person who gave the drink its name was far cooler than the drink itself.